We're going to try to learn in Mitzvah Shem the first three pieces, and then we're going to fast forward to other pieces. So the first piece of the Meshech Chochma for Parshas Pinchas is in Perek Chafhei Pasuk Yud Aleph. That's 25:11. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron. All the Mefarshim want to know, why does the Torah have to emphasize the lineage of Pinchas and go all the way back to his grandfather Aaron? And just to give you an example, my Rebbe Zichron Levracha used to say that the Torah wanted to go out of its way to say that Pinchas is following in the footsteps of Aaron. Lest one think that Pinchas is a warrior, he's a man of peace. And that's what Aaron was. But in any event, we're going to study now the Meshech Chochma and his unique approach. And he says the following, that Pinchas accomplished two great things. I guess you would say that he hit the bird, he hit two birds with one makkah, so to speak. I'm just using that phrase. Number one, he killed Zimri as a matter of nikmas kvod Hashem shelo yischalel. This was an act on behalf of God, the glory of God, to protect the glory of God, that it shouldn't be desecrated. V'zeu kanoim, and this is indicative or typical of kanoim zelats, hamakanim l'kvod hamakom ve'uma. And that's called, in the Gemara's language, in Meshech Sanhedrin, habol aramis kanoim pogimbo. And Rashi explains what's kanoim pogimbo. Rashi says, kin aso shel makom. It's, so to speak, to revenge on behalf of God. So that's one aspect of Pinchas's act of zealous, of being a zealot, of kanoim pogimbo, and that's l'kvod hamakom. Vasheni number two is shehifkir es kol ha'olam haba v'kinei l'tova shel Yisrael. The second dimension is that he was willing to give up his entire share in the world to come, and we'll explain exactly what that means here in this context, for the sake of Klal Yisrael. And that means that the Magefa was so severe as a result of the immorality of Klal Yisrael with Bnos Moav that it threatened to destroy the people of Israel. And this action, in which Pinchas was a kanoi, was on behalf of Klal Yisrael. This is a whole new dimension of the kanos of Pinchas. Now, what does it mean that Pinchas was willing to put his olam haba on the line? And that's also based on the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara says, interpreting a pasuk in Tehillim, Vayamod Pinchas Vayafalel. Vayafalel means where you have a justice, like a court case with someone, and the litigant who's suing someone puts forth a claim. He presents his case in front of the court. And Pinchas, in this Maisa Kanos, actually placed a claim against the Almighty in front of the heavenly courts. Sha'asa plilos imkono. He put forth a case against his creator. And he said the following. Again, this is all a Gemara in Sanhedrin. Pinchas says, Al Ela Yehargu, because of these people, Yehargu Chaf Dalid Elef Mi Yisrael, 24,000 Jews have to perish because of the sins of these. And by doing so, and putting a case against Aviyachal, against the Almighty, that itself puts Pinchas and his future on the line. This was an act of we call it chutzpah. I guess you'd in English maybe you'd call it daring, that to be so daring and bold. And if, says the Meshech Chochma, there are two dimensions to Pinchas's kanos, which is itself a great insight on the part of the Meshech Chochma, then maybe we have an answer to the question of Elazar and Aaron. Why is it that the Torah went out of its way to trace the lineage of Pinchas back to two people, his father and his grandfather, Elazar and Aaron? And he says the following. As far as the first dimension, of Pinchas's act of Canons on behalf of Kvod Hashem to actually destroy the life of one of the princes of Shevet Shimon, Zimri, for the sake of Kvod Hashem, he's following the legacy of his father Elazar. And in order to appreciate that, I would suggest, if you can, and you have an access to a Chumash with Rashi, to open up to Dvarim Perik Yud Pasuk Vav, that's 10:6, and look for a Rashi that starts with the words Ubnei Yisrael. Now, it's a long, complicated Rashi. What I'm going to do for you is I'm going to give you a little bit of a summary, a highlight of that Rashi. If you have a chance with your eye to follow the Rashi inside, Rashi is bothered by the presentation, the sequence of the Masos, the way it's presented there. And it seems that they went from Be'eros to Bnei Yakan to Mosera. And Rashi says that's impossible. There's a gap here of 8 different Masos that are left out. In fact, Rashi points out that the progression of the Masos, the way they're presented there, is exactly the opposite of the progression towards the Holy Land. So Rashi says that this whole pasuk is integrated into the Tochacha, into the rebuke of HaKadosh Baruch, of Moshe Rabbeinu to the people of Israel in Sefer Dvarim. And what is this rebuke about? It's about the last half of the 40th year in the Midbar. Imagine the Jews messed up after trudging through the Midbar for 40 years. How did they mess up? Aaron dies, and the Ananei HaKavod that protected them against the enemies, that received all the blisteros and all the arrows, all this was gone. All that protection was gone. The people went into despair. Imagine, they're on the verge of entering into the Holy Land after 40 years through the Midbar. They're about to throw in the towel. And the loss of faith was a result of Histalkus Ananei HaKavod. After Aaron died, the Ananei HaKavod that protected the people dissipated, they were removed, and the people went into a tension. We only know this from Rashi. Rashi knows it from Chazal. But what happens? An entire population of Israel starts retracing their steps, one masa after the other, in a mass bedlam, going back towards Mitzrayim, because the king of Arad was threatening in a military campaign against Israel, and there were no Ananei HaKavod. Aaron had died. They were in a fright, and they started moving very quickly, retracing the steps 8 masos back, and that's why the sequence of the masos here is the way it is. At this point, Shevet Levi, as they did back in the Chet HaEgel, took the front, shall I say, the leadership role, and they knew that all was at stake here. That segment of the population was leading the people to a state of fear, frustration, and the people themselves would sin, they would give up their faith, and maybe they too, like the others, would start traveling back to Mitzrayim. So Shevet Levi realized that they have to take up arms. There's no other way that they can stave off the situation. But Aaron is gone. So how is Shevet Levi going to make that decision? A decision of tremendous importance. And at the helm was Elazar ben Aaron. Elazar, the pasuk says, took over the leadership role, and he commanded the military members of Shevet Levi to go out, run 8 masos back to stave off this rebellion. And many Jews died as a result. Many Levium died as well in the battle. But what was motivating Elazar to, as we say, take over the helm and tell the people of Shevet Levi to destroy those Jews that had run back to Mitzrayim? It was L'Kvod Hashem. This was an act of Canons, for the honor of God, because the people had rejected their faith in God. Pinchas likewise, receiving, so to speak, the legacy of his father Elazar, is going to become a kanoi to destroy a member of Klal Yisrael of a great significance for the sake of Kvod Hashem. And that's the first aspect of Pinchas's kanos. And to quote the Meshech Chochma, Hargu Yisrael, the Leviim, killed amongst the people of Israel, the man Kvod Yisrael, V'HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kida Amar Bereish Yuma, and he quotes Yerushalmi in Yuma to that effect, V'Nasi, Nasieh HaLevi, who was at the helm for Shevet Levi at that moment, to make that momentous decision was Elazar ben Aaron. Harebet Sivuyav Nasazeh. It was Aaron's command and his decision to fight a military battle, what we used to call friendly fire of one Jew against the other. And all this is Laman Kvod Yisrael v'Hashem. And to what extent, and with regard to what dimension, is the Kanos of Pinchas a legacy from his grandfather Aaron? And the answer is because the Medrash tells us that Aaron, when he asked the people at the Chet Egel to bring forth their gold, and he would put him into the fire, the furnace, and create the Egel Azav, all this was a delay tactic. And he made the Egel in order to hope that maybe the people of Israel would be spared and they would not worship the idol, maybe. And he knew, and Aaron knew very well, that he was forfeiting his place in the world to come. Because how could he be a partner in the crime? And Aaron declares, Mutav sheyitlu asicharon bi v'al ye'avdu Yisrael. Let me be blamed for this, so that the people of Israel would not perish. Array, what we see about Aaron is Litolelios Yisrael, for the benefit and the protection and the salvation of Israel. Ishlich kol chelko b'olam haba. It's only later that Moshe prayed on behalf of Aaron, and Aaron regained his portion in the world to come. Lachein Yichso, therefore the pasuk here traces the lineage of Pinchas to Aaron because of the Avas Yisrael of Pinchas. Pinchas realizes he's giving up his whole future, not only in this world, but also the next. And all this is because of Kvod Yisrael, Avas Yisrael, because the Magefa was so severe that the Jewish people and their future were at stake. Let's take a look at the next piece. And if you have a Chumash, right here, you just go one pasuk ahead of yourself. Hineni no seilo esbrisi shalom. This next piece is absolutely stunning, and I want to change the name of this series to, when I was in college, they had a course called Art Appreciation. I don't know if you ever heard of it. Anyway, this is called Reb Meir Simcha Appreciation. It gets to the point where it's almost idol worship. I mean, we get to the point where we have to worship this man, Reb Meir Simcha. He is just so creative and so original. It just defies human comprehension. He starts by quoting a Medrash. And if you have your copy, by chance, of the Meshech Chochma, you want to underline the first word, bidin. That's the main word here. The entire piece is an attempt to explain in a very new way the word bidin. Sheyitol es schara. The comment in the Medrash is that Pinchas's action is worthy of reward. And what does that mean? It's worthy of reward. So on this Medrash, we have a number of super commentaries. One of them is called the Marizu. And he says that Pinchas got the okay from something called the Midas Hadin up in Shamayim. And it was a justice that was meted out against Zimri from the laws of Din. and therefore the kitrug, normally the prosecution would come from midas hadin. So the Marizuk says that that's what it means bidin, that through din, meaning through the mid of din, Pinchas was able to, up in Shomayim, I mean, he didn't do it himself, but the Malachim up in Shomayim were able to mitigate any kind of prosecution against him, because the din was in favor of Pinchas and was maskim to Pinchas, and therefore the Satan, who usually is Mekatrik, was quieted down because of din, and therefore he was able, Pinchas, to collect schar. However, Rabbi Simcha, based on a pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi, has a new interpretation of the din. The pasuk says, "Imru tzadik ki tov ki pri malalehem yochelu." Somehow, the pasuk, and we'll emphasize two phrases in the pasuk. One is ki tov, and the other is pri malalechem. Ki tov means when the tzaddik implements good, his reward is going to be pri malalechem. Somehow, from the goodness that the righteous people generate, that will be the source of generating his reward. And that reward, pri malalechem, is in this world. Pri malalechem means the fruits of your accomplishment in this world. Says Rameir Simcha, Shnei and Yodi mitzvos. You know, we used to categorizing mitzvos in many different ways. Losa says in essays, etc., etc. Rameir Simcha has his own categorization, brand new, of how to categorize mitzvos. They fit into one of two classifications. And then Afkamina is going to be where the schar, where the reward is going to be meted out. Number one, we have a group of mitzvos which will be rewarded not in this world, but only in the next. And what characterizes those mitzvos? Lincoln be ose risha, viladov pole of. There's a lot of flowery, Rabbi Simcha poetry here, and he says that to stave off the influences of the evildoers, that's a mitzvah, and the goal of that is Hema lo yafrichu pri rishayim b'kerem Hashem, rishasam b'kerem Hashem, so that they shouldn't infect. I hate to use that word in these situations that we find ourselves, but not to infect others and stare them and remove them from serving Hashem, and that is what's called kotzim ani machala min hakerem in the language of Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon in the Gemara in Shabbos. The inyan kazeh, in this kind of mitzvah, where there's nothing new that the righteous people have generated, there's nothing positive really per se, it's just staving off the negative influence of the Rishayim. Leka schar b'olam hazeh, rak shomer hu li'olam hagmul. Any reward is going to be preserved for the next world. Why? Kevan shelo asa tov ba'olam hamasa. The olam hamasa means this world. There was no goodness that was added to this world. It was just to undermine the power and the negative influence of the Rishoyim. And that's something between man and God in the ultimate world of infinity of Olam Haba. Then he has a contrast with other mitzvahs that fit another category. And they are mif'alos chesed v'tova. This is where the righteous people engender goodness and benevolence. They do good for others. The elu with regard to these, ochlim peroseyem ba'olam hazeh. The Gemara tells us that those who do great things in this world, like for example, you could talk about kibbut avayim, and you could talk about tzedakah, and you could talk about oseh shalom ben ish lechavero. All these kinds of acts of righteousness will be rewarded in this world. Kimoshemanu chachami bereish mefanin. By the way, I don't know if you do the Daf Yomi, but if you do the Daf Yomi on Shabbos, at least, then this is tomorrow's Daf that he's making reference to. The Gemara has a long discussion about which kinds of mitzvahs are rewarded here in this world, and the Keren Kayemis L'Olam Haba, in a very intricate and complicated Agadita, which is tomorrow's Daf Kuf Chav Zayin. And what's common, says Rabbi Simcha, to all those mitzvos which are singled out by different statements of different Amoraim in the Gemara for reward in this world, is that they are all Maaseh Chesed V'Tov. They add something Tov to the world, and they will be rewarded in this world, because in this world of finitude, they have added Tov. V'zeu sha'amru, and this is Sha'amar Yeshaya Navi, as we said before. He tells us that Tzaddik Ki Tov, it means that Tzaddik who does good in this world, is Prima Lechem Yochelu. They'll eat the fruits of their goodness in this world. And he says the following: but Tzaddik Shosa Nakam, he revenges and avenges for God against the Rishonim, he will be rewarded only in the world to come. And he applies this to a pasuk in Tanakh regarding Eliyahu and Navi. Malacha po Eliyahu. Eliyahu does an act of revenge against the enemies of God, and some of them were unfortunately Ovdei Baal amongst the Jewish nation. And Malacha po, says Rabbi Yosef, what's Malacha po? What reward do you deserve in this world? You're only designated for reward in the next world. L'chein kan she Pinchas asa ma'asen nokam. Pinchas, like Eliyahu later on in history, will avenge the Rishayim, in this case Zimri. V'dokar b'chanisa peten ish halo mitzvah kazos hikina l'chvod Hashem. What motivates Pinchas is for the glory of God, to destroy evil. That doesn't generate any chesed, any good, any tov in this world. And l'man shelo yomru hitiru pruchim es hadavar. The reason that motivated Pinchas is that the spectators will see that Aaron and Moshe let this go on, the public immorality of Zimri. And they're going to say, well, if the Prushim, those who are very separate from immorality, like Moshe and Aaron, let this go on, then lo yasu es levav Yisrael me Hashem bizonos im bnos necha. Pinchas understood that the people of Israel would continue following, imitating the sample, the behavior, the filthy behavior, the immorality of Zimri, and they will continue in znus with Bnos Necha. According to the premise that we laid down, Pinchas doesn't deserve any reward. That's between him and the Maker in the eternal world. Lo kain as Hashem Yisparach. Hashem Yisparach wants to give Pinchas a tangible reward in this world. And nasan lo peiros of biolam hazeh. And the peiros are given in this world. V'zehu, and now we understand the word bidin. What is the bidin? The bidin is that Pinchas is involved in a double act of Canons. It's not only lichvod Hashem, to destroy the Rishayim, but shebe'emes heichela magefa, the terrible plague had begun, and the pasuk says, "Vayamod Pinchas vayafalel v'teiotzer hamagefa." Pinchas stood in front of his Maker with a case against God Himself, the otzar, and he stopped the magefa. In Kena Reza Hatzolas Nefashos Shel Klal Yisrael. Pinchas is involved in the greatest Hatzolah. We talk about the great Hatzolah people. They had recently a fundraiser for Hatzolah, amazing amount of money, because we all know what Hatzolah does. But the greatest Hatzolah was that of Pinchas, who Pikuach Nefashos Revavos, said he saved many tens and hundreds of thousands of Jews. Limeid Zchus al Klal Yisrael, he was the attorney up in the heavenly courts on behalf of Klal Yisrael. The defense, Asher al Adon Lekaf Zchus Amrinon, the Gemara in that same Magadita, that's for tomorrow's daf, if you'll get up to it, is Adam Ochel Peruseim Yom Hazeh, a person who's Malamed Zchus for someone else, finds merit on their behalf and protects them from heavenly judgment, is going to eat the peros in this very world. That's a great act of tov. And therefore the Bidin says HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheyitol schar. He deserves the schar because Heishiv es chamosi me'al b'nei Yisrael she'otzar es ha'magefel achein hineni nosein lo es brisi sholom. And as we'll soon see, all of the generations of Pinchas were Kohanim Gedolim, both in Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni. This is all part of the great reward for the Tov. This is the Tov. This is not just to destroy the Rishoyim of Pinchas in the salvation of Klal Yisrael. Now we go on to the third. We'll skip a little bit if you have time to Pasuk Yud Beis Yud Gimel in the same chapter, the very next piece in Reb Meir Simcha. Now, I'm going to, in a sense, let the cat out of the bag here, if you don't mind, and I'm going to tell you, after reading through this entire piece, what was bothering the man, because Reb Meir Simcha never asks this question. He always answers it. You got to figure out what was bothering him. It's very interesting. The pasuk says, Lachein emor, which means, Moshe, you transmit the following message to Pinchas. Inini nosein lo es brisi sholom. Wait a second. HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Pinchas were not on talking terms? Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu have to appoint Moshe to notify Pinchas of his great reward? Couldn't Hashem tell Pinchas directly? Again, you won't see this in the words of this paragraph, but I'm telling you, Lefi Ani Estaiti, that's what's bothering Reb Meir Simcha. Abir. And here Reb Meir Simcha quotes a very intricate statement of the Rambam in his Hakdama to Pirush HaMishnayos, which was written in Judeo-Arabic and the greatest translation that we have after 1,000 years, because forget about Ibn Tibin, no offense, but we have Kapach. And Kapach's translation is the following. V'nishar, this is the language of the Rambam, translated into Hebrew. V'nishar b'kam inyan gadol shetzarich levaro. I have here something very important, says the Rambam, that I want to teach you. V'hu shanavi im nisnabe ra'os libnei adam shenischayvu b'kach. If the prophet prophesizes evil for those who have committed sins, it could be that terrible prophecy will not come to fruition. And at some point down the line, God could grant mechila to the sinners. But, however, says the Rambam, what about a nevula tova, in which the prophet is meant to transmit a message about God's promise of goodness to bestow benevolence upon the people of Israel? Says the Rambam, it all depends. If God gives a promise that is not transmitted to a Navi, but rather God reveals a promise through his Torah, then there's no guarantee, like in the case of Nevulah Ra, that will come to pass. And that's why we find over and over again that Yaakov Avinu was afraid that maybe God would not live up to his promise because perhaps we will sin. However, says the Rambam, Im iftiach tova le'am Yisrael al yedei navi, if a Navi is given prophecy to be transmitted, and that prophecy is for good, Tova, then hu mekayma behechlet, then that's an absolute guarantee. No backs touch blacks. God will certainly live up and fulfill that promise, litova. And therefore, the Rambam goes through all the cases of Shema Yigra Machet, and they're all cases where the Navi was not commanded to transmit his nevuah to others. And says the Rambam, how do we, the Pasuk says, Elov Tishmun, we have to follow in the words, the commands of the Navi. How do we know he's a Navi Emes? Maybe he's a Navi Sheker. And the answer is because he transmits a nevuah l'tova. And with a nevuah l'tova, we have a barometer and we can test them out. Because if that nevuah does not come to fruition, then we know it's a Navi Sheker. Because a nevuah l'tova that's transmitted by a Navi must come to fruition. Based on this Rambam, Rameir Simcha has a new insight into Emor, to the word Emor. Lachein Emor. He says the following. It's an absolute no backs. It's not retractable. Promised from the divine being. And then it becomes a maimer muchla. It's absolute, it's not conditional. Lo yudei t'nai. And he says the following: Zeu sha'amar Hashem, Pinchas heishiv es chamasi v'lo kilisi, etc., etc. And imagine what was the impact of Pinchas's Canons. HaKadosh Baruch Hu testifies that his impact is for all times, for all eternity, because the lives that he saved. I always think of those who saved lives during the Holocaust and the generations that came from them. You talk about the Adler family, there's so many examples, and they now get together hundreds and hundreds upon descendants of those who were saved by Chassidu Umas HaOlam and the like. Pinchas did something great for the salvation of Israel that's eternal for all generations. Lachein Amar. Therefore, Hashem declares, he deserves, Pinchas, an eternal reward because of his eternal greatness and his salvation. That's Midah Keneged Midah. But Amarlo, you, Moshe Rabbeinu, tell him, why does this nevuah have to be transmitted through Moshe? After all, says Rameir Simcha, Afal Pichaya Navi, Pinchas was a Navi. He could have received the prophecy. How does Rameir Simcha know that Pinchas was a Navi? Based on a pasuk in Divrei Hayomim, and Rashi's interpretation of that pasuk, it says in Divrei Hayomim, Pinchas ben Elazar, Lifnim Hashem Imo. What does it mean, Lifnim Hashem Imo? Says Rashi, Lifnim Hashem Imo. So Pinchas was a Navi. Why did not HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveal this promise to Pinchas directly? Oh, no. Hashem says, Emor, you, Moshe Rabbeinu, will transmit this nevuah. And why? Because lo ulizaro akra bris kahunas olam. This reward is irretractable. Because there's no yigram achet. And it cannot be Nigro Machet. Why? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm giving this to the Navi, to Moshe Rabbeinu, to transmit to Pinchas. Had it been a direct communication between Hashem to Pinchas, then like the promises that Hashem gave to the Amos, there would be Shema Yigro Machet. But now that Moshe Rabbeinu is given the task, the responsibility to pass on this nevuah, it's a nevuah l'tova through a Navi, and it can never be rescinded. It's a bris kunas olam. And Rabbi Simcha ends this presentation by telling us that the children and the descendants of Pinchas, not only in Bayis Rishon, but even in Bayis Sheni, were the Kohanim Gedolim. And therefore, Kevan Shenemar Yidei Moshe Shu Navi Hu Kayam Li'olam. An absolutely brilliant insight of Rabbi Simcha. Now, I'm going to tell you where the next pasuk is, but if anyone has any comments or questions, now's a good time. But in the meantime, turn, if you will, fast forward to Perek Zayin, Pasuk Tesvav. Vayidaber Moshe el Hashem lemar. Actually, I have the Chumash open here because you won't appreciate this piece of Rabbi Simcha unless you see the context. And Moshe Rabbeinu turns to Hashem's Revi, the fourth Aliyah. In our shul, it's the same guy who gets all the Aliyah, so it's not too exciting. But anyway, in Revi, Hashem turns to Moshe and says the following. I'm sorry, my mistake. That's Pasuk Vav. We're in Pasuk Tesvav. So let's fast forward. Okay, this is actually in the middle of Revi. Who initiates the conversation between God and Moshe? In this case, it's Moshe. And Moshe asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu to appoint his Moshe Rabbeinu's successor. Yifkar Hashem Elokei Haruchos. So Rabbi Simcha is bothered by this. And again, we always have to underline one key word, and that's the word lemar. When Hashem speaks to Moshe lemar, it means pass this on, transmit this to the people. Lemar lomar lacherim. But here, it's Moshe Rabbeinu who's speaking to the Ribbon Shalom. And he's asking Hashem with a great petition, a great bakasha, Yifkad Hashem, Elokei Aruchos L'chol Basar, Ish Al Ha'eda, Asher Yetzei Lifneim, etc., etc. And Moshe Rabbeinu details the profile, the characteristics of this great leader who is meant to replace Moshe. There were a couple of candidates. Pinchas himself was a candidate, and certainly his father Elazar was a candidate. But Hashem prefers Yoshua. What does the word lemar mean? Rabbi Simcha opens his presentation with a quote from the Sifri. Now, what I'd like you to do is, with your eye, if you happen to have Rabbi Simcha in front of you, skim with your eye. I'm going to highlight the main points of this Sifri. The Sifri is bothered by the language lemar in 4 different places in the Torah. In all these 4 places, the conversation is initiated by Moshe Rabbeinu. For example, Moshe Rabbeinu turns to the Ribbon Shalom and he says, the following. Vaydaber Moshe lifnei Hashem lemar, hein b'nei Yisrael lo shomu elai, v'heich yishmeni paro, v'ani aral svasai. And Moshe is asking Hashem, how do I know that, and why would Paro listen to me? And once again, the Sifri, in the name of Rabbi Elazar Azariah, is going to ask the question, Ma tamaloma lemar. What does Moshe Rabbeinu mean when he says lemar? And another example he gives is Vayomer Hashem Moshe Atka tir'eh es asher eseh leparo. Oh no, I'm sorry. That's Hashem's response to Moshe's request. Ki biyad chazaka yishlachim. Fine. Then Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem lemar kel norafanalon. This has to do with Moshe requesting the restoration of the health of his sister Miriam after she got tzaras. Another case, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'avia yarok yarak b'fanea. And finally, our pasuk here, Vaydaber Moshe el Hashem lemar yifkar Hashem elokei aruchos. So Rabbi Elazar Azariah in the Sifri says that the word lemar is an implicit question in which Moshe Rabbeinu wants to know, Hashem, I'm putting forth this petition, will you respond positively and hearken to my words? And in each case, if you go through the 4 cases, Hashem responds, yes, I will respond positively. Paro will listen to me. I will restore the health of Miriam. And for example, in our case, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Kach lecha es Yoshua ben Nun, Asher Ruach bo, and Hashem complies with Moshe's petition and appoints Yoshua as his successor. All this is in parentheses in our copies of Reb Meir Simcha, of the Meshech Chochma, and it's all just a summary of the words of the Sifri. Reb Meir Simcha only at the end of this paragraph, it's a long paragraph, but 99% of it is just a quote verbatim from the Sifri, indicating what the word lamar means. And now, Reb Meir Simcha adds another point, another variable into the equation, based on the Gemara Pesachim on Daf Mem Beis. The Gemara Pesachim tells us that the word lamar could be understood in one of two ways. And the Gemara quotes two opinions. The first is the opinion of Rebbe, and Rebbe is interpreting the word lamar in the Parsha in Vayikra Yud Ches, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lamar. And that's the Parsha of what's called Balei Mum. In Kodshim, if an animal has some sort of a blemish, a serious blemish, then it becomes puzzle, disqualified for the Mizbeach. And this is a mitzvah aseh, in which the Torah commands that we take what's called a tmima. That means an animal that has no mum. And as a result of the essay of tmima l'mizbeach, we derive that we're not allowed to bring on the mizbeach an animal that's a balas mum. And now Rebbe in the Gemara Pesachim is bothered by the following question. The pasuk says, "Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lamar," and then it says, "Daber al Aaron ve'el bonav ve'el kol bnei Yisrael ve'amarta al Leah." The Gemara is bothered by this. Normally, the word lamar reveals that you should transmit it, but here the pasuk itself is explicit, it's outspoken. It says Daber al Aaron, etc., etc. Im kain, ma talmud lomo lamar. What does the word lamar mean? And here we have two opinions. We'll start with Rebbe. Rebbe says in the Gemara Pesachim that the word lamar indicates what's called a nutrikin. Nutrikin is when you take a word and you break it down to smaller parts, and you read it as smaller segments. The word lamar, says Rebbe, actually, this is Bar Kapara responding to Rebbe's question, is notrikin lo ne'emar. What is lo ne'emar? The Parshas zu yesh gam lav v'gam esek. In other words, with regard to bringing a balmum on the mizbeach, there's not only a violation of an essay that requires and mandates a tmima, there's also a violation of a lav. And that lav is always derived from the word lo. And where's the word lo? The word lo, says by Kapara, is hidden in the word lamar. Lo, and you read it, lo nema. Lo nema. What's being said is lo. And that's a lotus. And then the Gemara quotes the second opinion of Beirav, and they say, no, it's not a notrikin. What is lamar? Lo amar. In other words, that the answer is always going to be lo. Pirish lav amaro. The Parshas zu al hanemar. In other words, you take the word lo, and then you have the word emar. So lamar is lo emar, meaning tell them lo. That whatever's written in this parsha, add a lo to it. But what's common to both the understanding of Bar Kapara and that of Beirav is that the language of lamar indicates lo. It indicates that the answer is lo. Based on this, we can interpret the Sifri. What Moshe Rabbeinu in those 4 cases that we discussed, like will Paro listen to me and will you heal Miriam, etc. Moshe Rabbeinu, by adding the word lemar, is saying lo emor in a question mark. Is the answer to my request in the negative? Or will you, God, hearken to my words? And Hashem is being asked by Moshe Rabbeinu to appoint a successor. And Moshe Rabbeinu wants to know, Lamar, please tell me it's Lo Amar. Is the answer to my question Lo? Or is the answer yes, you will hearken to my prayers? And that's what Hashem says in the next pasuk, go appoint Yoshua. So we see a whole new pshat in the word Lamar. Let's just read Rameir Simcha, it's very short. He says, Darish Lamar Lashon Lo Emar, Hainu, Im Lo Taseh Kidvarai, Hodieni. Please let me know if you're not going to capitulate to my request. Hain Olav, yes or no. That's all implicit in that one word, Lamar. Let's go on to the next paragraph. In Rameir Simcha, this is Chaf Zayin, Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Pasuk says, Ilifnei Elazar HaKohen Yamod V'shal lo b'mishpat ha'urim. Here, the Torah is telling us that there's something called Urim, meaning Urim V'tumim, which is worn on the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, and any issue of significance should be addressed to the Urim V'tumim. That's called She'elu. And Rabbi Simcha opens up with one word, Lepele. Lepele. What is Lepele? What is bothering the mind of Rabbi Simcha? Let me suggest the possibility and see if the text of the Meshech will bear me out. It would seem from the simple interpretation of the pasuk that the responsibility of asking questions to the Urim V'tumim falls on the shoulders of Elazar of the Kohen Gadol, and that should be true throughout history, throughout the Tanakh, that a Kohen Gadol would always be the one who would ask for an answer from the Urim V'tumim. And yet, that's not really true. In history doesn't bear that out. In the Beis HaMikdash, we don't find in all the places that the Kohen Gadol was the one who asked the question to the Urim V'tumim. In fact, although during the Yemei HaShoftim, and I'm asking you to look into Rabbi Simcha inside, it was the Kohen Gadol who asked the question to the Urim V'tumim. That's true also in the period of Shaul and David HaMelech, in those 2 periods of time. But then, during the period of the Beis HaMikdash, we don't find that in an Eis Tzara and Eis Milchama, it was the Kohen Gadol who asked. It was always the Navi who was asked what to do. And Rameir Simcha gives us an example from Yehoshaphat, and that's in Malachim Beis, Perek Gimel, and it's the Navi. Wait a second. Beis HaMikdash, there's a Kohen Gadol, is there not? Our pasuk indicates that it's the Kohen Gadol's responsibility. We turn to him and we address our questions with regard to anything of a davar shel tzara, any impending disaster, chas v'shalom. In the case of milchama, when we have adversaries threatening us in a military campaign, we turn our questions through the Kohen Gadol to the Urim V'tumim. And instead, what we find throughout history, beyond the period of Shoftim, Shaul, and David, during the Beis HaMikdash, it was always the Navi who would answer these questions. So Rabbi Simcha invokes a Gemara in Masech Yoma on Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis. The Gemara says, "Kol kohen she'eino medaber beruach hakodesh u'shchina shoralav ein sholim bo." That the requirement and the profile for the Kohen Gadol to ask the question to him, address the question to him, so that he'll in turn activate the Urim V'Tumim to get us an answer, only applies if the Kohen Gadol fills the profile of Hashchina Shora Olav V'hu Medaber B'Ruach HaKodesh. Says Rabbi Simcha that during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, we did not have a Kohen Gadol who reached that level and achieved that precondition, that description of Yedaber B'Ruach HaKodesh V'Tishal of Ruach HaShchina. And therefore, the only individual member of Klal Yisrael who would be fit for that description of Yedaber B'Ruach HaKodesh could only be a Navi. And the Kohen Gedolim didn't reach that level of Nevuah, of Yedaber HaKodesh Baruch Hu Imo, of Ashchina Shora Ola. Therefore, says Rabbi Simcha, I have a new interpretation of a parsha in Divrei Hayom. I'll read to you the psukim in Divrei Hayom, most of which are here in Rabbi Simcha. It says, Ben Sheshesrei Shana Uzziah b'Molcho. Uzziah was appointed as king at a very, very young age. He was only 16 years old. And Divrei Hayomim records that that he reigned in the city of Jerusalem for no less than 52 years. He followed, says the Pasuk, in the footsteps of his father Amatzio, and he did everything that was good in the eyes of Hashem. Now here comes the strange Pasuk. Which might mean when it came to ask Hashem to be Dorish Elokim, we had a question that we had to get an answer to. And then, all of a sudden, the Pasuk says, B'mei Zechariyahu. It was during the time of Zechariyahu. And Hamevin Bir'os Elokim, B'mei Darshas Hashem, Hitzlichu Elokim. God brought success during this period of time when they were Dorish Elokim, and that was during the period of time of Zechariah. The whole pasuk is really one confusing, convoluted mystery, and the Mefarshim in Divrei Hayomim have tremendous problems figuring out what the pasuk is all about. As Rameir Simcha, that when we get to the period of Uzziyahu HaMelech, and the Beis Hamikdash stands, there wasn't a Kohen Gadol who was Medaber B'Ruach HaKodesh V'Tishra Shechina Olav, and therefore there's no one to be Doresh the Urim V'Tumim. Therefore, the pasuk mentions Zechariah. Zechariah was a very unique individual. Now, let me say something about Zechariah, which makes me very excited. And that is, Zechariah was the Kohen Gadol. And how do Chazal know that Zechariah was the Kohen Gadol? Because the Kohenim Gedolim, during the period of Bayis Sheni, almost all of them were called Azariah, great name. And Zechariah, the Gemara says, is to be identified with Azariah. And he had two names. One is called Azariah, one is called Zechariah. I have to tell this to Mr. Greenblatt. He used to always call me Zechariah. He never got my name straight. But it's okay because Zechariah was Azariah. And what's unique about Zechariah as Kohen Gadol? Haya hayachid shahaya Kohen Gadol medaber beruach hakodesh v'ashchina shorei imo. Of all the Kohenim Gedolim during the period that spans over 8 centuries of Bais Rishon Bais Sheni, there was only one Kohen Gadol that reached the level of HaKadosh Baruch Hu medaber imo beruach hakodesh v'ashchina shora olah, and that was Zechariah, none other than Zechariah. He was the only Kohen Gadol fit that bill. Now let's go back to the pasuk in Divrei Hayom, and it reads so beautifully. The pasuk says, "Vayehi lidrosh Elokim," that during the reign of Uzziah, they needed to ask a question from God, and the pasuk goes out of the way to tell you that at that moment in time, who was the Kohen Gadol who served in the Mikdash? It was Bimei Zechariah. And the pasuk describes Zechariah in the following way: "Hamevin bir'os Elokim," that he saw the vision of God. In other words, God Shechina was Shora on Zechariah. He had Ruach HaKodesh, and therefore, Bimei, during that period of time, Darshu es Hashem, they went to Zechariah the Kohen Gadol to ask for a question, an answer to a question. Vitzliach Hashem, Vitzliach Elokim. And God was Matzliach, he gave the answer through Zechariah. A brilliant insight of Rameir Simcha. So it starts with our pasuk that Elazar HaKohen Yamod V'Shalo Mishpat Urim. He was the Kohen Gadol, and as such, he had the responsibility to be the conduit between Klal Yisrael asking for an answer and the Urim V'Tumim. And then, indeed, all his descendants as Kohanim Gedolim filled that role during the period of time of the Shoftim, during the period of time of Shaul HaMelech and David HaMelech. What happened after David HaMelech? The answer is there was no longer Kohen Gadol who reached that level that is absolutely a prerequisite to be Shoel Ba'urim V'Tumim. But, says Rameir Simcha, there was one exception to that rule, and that is Zechariah. Yeah, Daniel, please.
Zechariah, was he relying on the Urim V'Tumim, or was he doing it as a Navi?
It seems from this Gemara that, and also the support that Rameir Simcha is bringing from the pasuk in Divrei Hayom, that he was functioning as a Kohen Gadol, not as a Navi, because the pasuk says that Lidrosh Elokim means to be Dorish Elokim through the Urim V'Tumim. Okay. Now, just because we don't have that much time, I want to finish up the finale. There's so much here in Parshas Pinchas, but if you could fast forward to the end of the parsha, and this is Perek Chav Tes, Pasuk Aleph. Rameir Simcha, based on the Yerushalmi, points out that there's a discrepancy between two psukim in the Torah that command us to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The later pasuk is here in Parshas Pinchas. The earlier one is Parshas Emor. But let's look first at our parsha, and it says B'chodesh Hashvi, etc. Chodesh. It says Kol Meleches Avoda Lo Sasu Yom Trua Yelochem. Now, notice two things that we have to emphasize in contrast to the parsha in Emor, as we're about to open up to Emor. If you have a chumash, open up, but without losing the place here, to Vayikra, Perek Chav Gimel, Pasuk Chav Dal. First of all, it says Yom Trua. It's the day of Trua. And secondly, look at the sequence. The Torah first tells us, before revealing and commanding the mitzvah of shofar, that Kol Meleches Avoda Lo Sas. Don't get involved on this day of Rosh Hashanah in any laborious malachas. Avoda, which is called Meleches Avoda. However, if we turn back, rewind to Parshas Emor, there we find that the Torah doesn't call it Yom Trua, but rather Zichron Trua, remember the Trua. And secondly, immediately afterwards, after the Torah commands us in Trua, the Torah tells us, Kol Meleches Avoda Lo Sas. It means that the sequence is reversed. Here, in Parshas Pinchas, the Torah opens up its description and its mandate for Rosh Hashanah with Kol Meleches Avoda Lo Sasu, and then only then goes on to the mitzvah of shofar. In the case of Parshas Emor, the order is reversed. Yerushalmi raises the following question, which again we've more or less spelled out the question of the Yerushalmi, and it says the following: Kasev Echad Omer, the pasuk says in Emor Zichron Trua, that we should remember the shofar. Because of Echad in the pasuk here in Pinchas says Yom Trua Yelochem HaKetzad. Oh, he meant to remember the shofar or to blow the shofar. Isman she ba b'Shabbos zichron trua. Mazkirin es hatrua avalo tokim b'trua. That if Rosh Hashanah falls on a weekday, then it's Yom Trua. That's the case here in Parshas Pinchas. But if it's an overlap between Rosh Hashanah and Shabbos, then it's only Zichron Trua, which means Mazkirin. Zichron Milashon Mazkirin. We mentioned the Trua in our Tfilos, and that's what we call Zichronos in the Musaf, but Lo Token. We will not blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Now, Rabbosai, this Yushalmi, which is also in the Medrash of Vayikra Rabbah, seems to be at loggerheads with the Bavli. The Talmud Bavli insists that if there's an overlap between Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah, we omit blowing shofar because of what's called Zera D'Rabbah. This is a rabbinic enactment because they're afraid that he might carry the shofar 4 amos to a Baki for the Baki to teach him how to blow shofar. The Yushalmi, on the other hand, is deriving this halacha that there's no shofar on Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah from a pasuk in Chumash, Zichron Trua, which indicates that it's a mitzvah doraisa, or I should say a din doraisa. But be that as it may, Rav Meir Simcha would like to illustrate from the psukim, from what we call pshuta shel mikra. If we read the psukim carefully, he wants to add an extra oomph, an extra proof to the Yerushalmi. And he says the following, that the discrepancy here between the two parshios of Truma is not just Yom Trua versus Zichron Trua, but there's another additional discrepancy, and that is in the sequence of Kol Meleches Avodah Lo Sas. He says the following. The Parshas Emor, Ksiv Shabboson Zichron Trua, Mishum de B'Shabbos Ein Token. He says that the reason why the Torah says Zichron Trua in Parshas Emor, to remember the Trua, not to blow the Trua, is because we're talking about a case of Shabbos. On Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar. So far, this is all that we got from the Yerushalmi. I don't need Rav Meir Simcha. But here he adds the following. Yesh l'chave, now we can understand, Gam, additionally, Masha Sham, there in Parshas Emor, Hikdim, Zichron Trua. First, the Torah commands us in Zichron Trua. The Achakach, and only afterwards, the Torah says, Mikra Kodesh, Kol Meleches Avodah Lo Sasu. Aval Kan, but in contrast here in Parshas Pinchas, first Kodem, it says Mikra Kodesh Yelochem, Kol Meleches Avodah Lo Tasu, and then Yom Trua Yelochem. So Meir Simcha says that here in Parshas Pinchas, the Torah had to go out of its way to introduce shofar with the following introduction. Kol Meleches Avodah Lo Sas. We have Parshas Emor. And in Parshas Emor, the Torah indicates that we only have a mitzvah of Zichron Trua. We're not allowed to blow the shofar. And now we fast forward to Parshas Pinchas. All of a sudden, the Torah says, blow the shofar, Yom Trua. How could that be? After all, you just finished telling me in Parshas Emor that the mitzvah is Zichron Trua. Recite memories of Trua of the shofar, don't blow the shofar. So the Torah had to give an answer to the question, how is it that on Rosh Hashanah, which is a Yontif and has an Isa Malacha, we're allowed to blow the shofar? And the answer is, the Torah introduces this mitzvah of Yom Trua with the words, Kol Meleches Avodah Lo Sasu. What is Meleches Avodah? Meleches Avodah means any malacha that's not Ochel Nefesh, as opposed to Meleches Ochel Nefesh. That's not called Meleches Avodah. And that's not an act of labor. Labor means, when you sweat it out and you build something on Shabbos, or you trap an animal, etc., etc. But ochel nefesh, which is bishul, cooking and baking, I mean, that's a pleasure. That's not called a meleches avoda. It's al karcha. If the Torah is allowing meleches ochel nefesh, and that's hinted at by the fact that Torah only prescribes meleches avoda, is al karchach ayri b'chol. It must be, as the Yerushalmi says, that our parsha in Pinchas is talking about a case where Rosh Hashanah falls on a weekday, and therefore, if it's a weekday, Yom Trua Yelachem. Therefore, you're allowed to blow the shofar. But now we go back to Parshas Emor. We ask ourselves the question: why didn't the Torah introduce the heter of blowing the shofar by telling us first that meleches avoda is prohibited, and this is not a meleches avoda? And the answer is Masha'en came to Parshas Emor she'ayri b'Shabbos. We're talking about a case where Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbos, as we saw in the Yerushalmi. Hikdim zichron trua. He first tells you that there's no blowing of the shofar. It's only a memory of the shofar because it's Shabbos and we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. And before I let you go, I just want to add one point here. That there's a Gemara in Meshech Shabbos, and I wonder if Rabbi Simcha might have in mind that Gemara. He doesn't spell it out. But the Gemara derives from the pasuk. This in Shabbos Kuf Lamed Aleph. We'll get to it in about a week. In the Daf Yomi, I'm just saying, for those who learn Daf Yomi. The Torah says, Kol meleches avoda lo sas. And the Gemara says, what does that come to exclude when it says meleches avoda? And the Gemara says it excludes two actions. One is called Redias Hapas, which means to remove the dough from the sides of the oven. And the other is excluded blowing of the shofar. And shofar is called Chochma v'yeina malach. It could be that that's what Rav Meir Simcha has in mind. Rav Meir Simcha is going to tell us that in our parsha, do you know why you're allowed to blow the shofar? Yom Trua Yelachem? Because Kol Meleches Avoda Lo Sasu, which the Gemara derives as a miyut from shofar. That shofar is not called a Meleches Avoda, it's a Chochma v'yeina malach. And therefore, Yom Trua Yelachem. With that, Rabbosai, I wish you all a great Shabbos, and thank you for participating. We were able to cover, I think, 5 insights, each one more brilliant than the other. Rabbi Simcha, if anyone has any questions, please stay on.
Rav Berzon.
Yes.
This is Chaim Roman. I didn't really understand why in Parshat Emor, the fact that Shabbat is why the Torah talked about Zichron first and then afterwards only Melacha.
Although blowing the shofar is a chachma, it's somewhere between heter and malacha asura. It's in this gray area in between. It's what we call bein hashmashos. It's the twilight zone. So the Torah in Parshas Emor is addressing the case where we have an additional problem on Rosh Hashanah in blowing the shofar, because above and beyond the fact that we have normally during the weekday, we'd have a mitzvah of shofar. We now have a collision with Shabbos. And on Shabbos, we have a chachma that's almost like a malacha. It's like a quasi-malacha, similar to malacha. And we're not going to get involved in a chachma on Shabbos. So the Torah opens up this parsha of Rosh Hashanah Shechaliyos b'Shabbos with the words Zichron Trua Yelachem, that we will not blow the shofar because shofar is a chachma. Now fast forward to Parshas Emor, and the Torah says blow the shofar Rosh Hashanah. The answer is because now we're talking about Kol Meleches Avoda Lo Sas. So we're talking about a day in which you are prohibited, you're enjoined from Meleches Avoda, and the Gemara derives from that pasuk Meleches Avoda to the exclusion of shofar. Shofar is not considered a meleches avoda. And now that we've excluded the shofar blowing from meleches avoda, meaning on Yontif we only have a meleches avoda, we conclude that this parsha in Pinchas is addressing the case of Rosh Hashanah B'chol. And if it's Rosh Hashanah B'chol, then Yom Trua Yelachem. And how do I know it's a day of Chol? Because the Torah says Kol meleches avoda lo sas, and the Torah is allowing you to blow the shofar because the shofar is not a meleches avoda; it's only a Chochma. And the Torah means to say is that on Yontiv as opposed to Shabbos, we only have a prohibition of meleches avoda. And before Rabbi Simcha, we knew that as well. But we thought that before Rabbi Simcha, the meleches avoda is coming to exclude ochel nefesh. And that itself, according to Rabbi Simcha, would be enough to justify that our Parsha in Pinchas is talking about Rosh Hashanah Chaliyos B'chol, because the Torah introduces the shofar by telling you that there's no Isur Ochel Nefesh, and you're allowed to cook. It must be that we're talking about Chol. And if we're talking about Chol, then Yom Trua Yelachem, then we're not inhibited by Shabbos, which would prevent us from blowing the shofar, as we saw in Yerushalmi, because the status of shofar is that middle status. It's not called a meleches avoda, but in Shabbos the Torah has a broader definition. The Torah drops the adjective avoda and it just prohibits malacha. And malacha in the broader sense could include even the blowing of the shofar. It's only on Chol, and in this case on Rosh Hashanah, which is Chaliyos B'chol, that the Torah mandates a much more limited kind of malacha, a limited scope malacha, which is called meleches avoda, and that's to exclude ochel nefesh, which is not qualified as meleches avoda, and to exclude shofar, which is a chochma, not a malacha. So we have two parshas: parsha of Shabbos, meaning when Rosh Hashanah overlaps with Shabbos, that's in Emor. Shofar is excluded; it's only zichron trua, and the parsha here in Pinchas, when Rosh Hashanah falls on a day of Chol, and now we have the mitzvah of Yom Trua to blow the shofar. And we should be Zochem Yitzhak Hashem to understand God's Torah and appreciate his the insights of Rameir Simcha, great chidushim. And with that, I'll wish you a great
Sure, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
Rabbi Berzon, can I ask
Yes.
you? Can I ask you a
who's
question?
there, Lenny?
Lenny, could I ask you a question from yesterday?
Yes, please.
The difference between Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos, and you were sort of putting forward the idea of a Shabbos Jew and a Rosh Chodesh Jew and the different ways that
I'm glad you were paying attention. Wow, I'm excited.
Yeah. Just why did we say Musaf Taka on Rosh Chodesh?
Well, there's a special
not a day of Malach or anything.
Right, there's a special carbon Musaf on Rosh Chodesh, and in the Beis Hamikdash, Rosh Chodesh was definitely a sanctified day.
It was a sanctified day.
Yes, in
Did they do
the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. Outside the Beis Hamikdash, there's no particular Kedushas Hayom, and we only have a memory, so to speak, a reflection of the Kedushas Hayom outside the Mikdash in the Tefillah of Musaf, because the Tefillah replaces the carbon.
Right. Sure, I will do that. That was lovely.
Okay, then.
Thank you very much indeed. Have a good Shabbos.
You too. Thank you so much.